Uh, Thank you very much for attending the last day of our 4-day conference on music, sound, and anti-Semitism. I'm Tina Frühauf. I'm chairing this session, and I'm one of the co-organizers of this symposium, together with Gordon Dale, who is still admitting people from the waiting room into our session, and Samantha Cooper. So before we start, just some housekeeping. Since we have a large group of people today, please send any questions for our speakers directly to me. You can also feel free to send them to Gordon Dale and to Samantha Cooper. And please do so via the Zoom chat. You can do this by selecting our names in the chat window and sending a private message. We'll collect the questions and share them with the speaker during the Q&A session. Our presentations are about 20 minutes long, followed by a brief discussion period thereafter. So it's now my distinct pleasure to welcome our first speaker, Abby Anderton, a colleague from Baruch College in New York. Gordon Dale will make accessible her full biography in the chat, so you can enjoy her reading about her accomplishments there. For the sake of time, we'd like to start with her paper right away. And thank you very much, Abby, for starting us off with your paper on anti-Semitism and the voice, singing as survival after 1945.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you to Tina, Sam, and Gordon for hosting this wonderful conference, and also the folks at the Center for Jewish History. As Tina mentioned, we're colleagues at CUNY, and I teach at Baruch College in the Graduate Center. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and please feel free to let me know if you're having any issues seeing or hearing what I am playing. Okay. Okay, so I'm working on a book project about music as a form of testimony. And in today's talk, I'd like to think with you a little bit about the differences in sung testimony versus a spoken testimony, and also thinking about women's voices as heard most especially in forms of song, perhaps in contrast to other forms of testimony. Voices were the most immediate instrument for testimony, at times in unison or heterophony, as many accounts shared similar experiences. Yet still and silent images, rather than audio recordings, have defined the cultural memory of the Holocaust, comprising what historian Cornelia Brink has called the visual iconography of the genocide. Today, as in 1945, it is easier for the outside observer to see images of the liberation than to hear it. And yet there were efforts to preserve this sound world for contemporary and future auditors. As I'm sure many of you in this Zoom room are aware, one of the earliest forms of recorded oral testimony was made by the Lithuanian-American psychologist David Boder, who traveled in the summer of 1946 with over 200 pounds of recording equipment to various displaced persons camps in France, Italy, and Germany. And he recorded survivors and eyewitnesses giving testimonies about their recent experiences. You can access these testimonies today on the Illinois Institute of Technology website, and many of them, as you can imagine, involved music. So Boder would often ask his participants to sing songs that they recalled from camps and ghettos, or songs from their pre-war lives. Just to give you a sense for the kind of technologies that we're working with in terms of sound, here's a recording of Ludwig Hamburger, a Polish-German survivor, who's going to sing a little bit of the Buchenwald-Lied or Buchenwald song.
Wenn der Tag erwacht und die Sonne lacht, die Kolonnen ziehen jeden Tages wehen hinein den Abenden Morgen, und der Wald ist schwarz und der Himmel rot, und wir tragen in Rot ein Stückchen Brot, und um Herzen die Sorgen. Oh, Buchenwald, ich kann dich nicht vergessen, weil du mein Schicksal bist. Wer dich verlässt, der kann es erst ermessen, wie wundervoll die Freiheit ist.
So the singing voice has an incredible expressive range, capable of vocalizing sounds from whispers and hums to belting vibrato, laughter, and cries. The ability to create a realm where, quote, the song was the only truth, as Butch ghetto survivor Miriam Havral wrote. Claude Lanzmann was aware of this when he featured Simon Srebrenik singing while rowing down the narrow river of his childhood memories during the opening of Shoah. And in the realm of fictional art house film, the protagonist survivor, Nelly, in Christian Petzold's Phoenix, is recognized by her husband only through her song. What does the act of singing do for a survivor in relation to testimony? Song can return to the survivor individuals and potentially their audiences to the traumatic moment, a portal to the experience itself, a sonic memorial, a kind of coping mechanism. As ethnomusicologist Joshua Pilzer notes, the trauma of survivorship does not have a discrete ending point. Rather, these experiences, quote, unfold over time, end quote. Singing creates a listening public, both distant and near, and the performative element compels listeners to suspend doubt, also a critical element in delivering and hearing testimony. And I should say, too, that survivor singing has certainly taken off, at least in ethnomusicology. There have been a number of studies about various survivor communities who have used song to draw attention to what has happened in their communities. And I'm thinking of Jessica Swartz's work on radiation survivors in the Marshall Islands of US nuclear testing, who sing with their radiated voices in order to sort of draw attention to the plight of their homeland. Saul Friedlander wrote that maintaining a sense of disbelief is critical to our understanding of the Holocaust, where historical knowledge cannot and should not rationalize away the event's complexities and contradictions. A singing survivor conjures a range of responses from the uncanny to the maudlin, as musicians appear to have reached the abyss and somehow returned. Some testimonies can reach an extended audience of close listeners and mere auditors. We can shut our eyes, but not as easily close our ears. There's an immersive quality to music, and even sometimes a participatory element in the case of collective singing, which can make audience members into themselves performers. The collaborative effort in singing protest or camp songs turns one from a passive subject to an active citizen. As anthropologist Victoria Stanford writes, the accretion of marginalized voices transforms experience into collective memory. There is an undeniable bodily connection to traumatic experience when a survivor sings, or the grain of the voice, as Roland Barthes writes. By considering the body in the voice as it sings, Barthes wants to awaken our ear to new modes of analysis, where the grain can replace more traditional subjective modes of criticism and interpretation. The grain allows us to hear in these pieces the trauma of experience. To sing at the most elemental level is to have survived. And for the musicologists in the room, you know that voice is certainly a very hot topic in musicology right now. If we think of Nina Sun Eidsheim's work on voice, vibration, as well as Will Chang and affect, this is kind of a question that's kind of very much in the air in music studies scholarship. In the work on survivor singers, scholars have focused on a number of critical areas. So if we think of sort of post-war iterations of the survivor singer, people have worked on this already for many decades. And I'm thinking of some of the people in the Zoom room, Brett Werb, Joseph Toltz, Anna Bucher, Shirley Gilbert, TINÉ, obviously, of survivor songs created in these camps and ghettos. Other folks have looked sort of at specific regional geographies, Jayla Flam, the Łódź Ghetto songs, Gabriela Knapp looking at the Ravensbrück songs, Barbara Malewski and her work on Kulishevitz, or in the realm of art music song, thinking of Amy Wlodarski and Terezin, the Ullmann opera Der Kaiser von Atlantis. And so the question is, how might we bring together this work to think about a kind of theory of a singing survivor? If we think of words perhaps as being the testimonial layer of this, and music as granting an affective layer, which allows the audience to suspend disbelief. I don't think it's mere coincidence that many of the survivor musicians in this talk were doing their most audible public work at the same time as the much publicized war crime trials of the 1960s. The Eichmann trial ushered in what Annette Vierviorka, who's written a lot of beautiful things on testimony, calls the era of witness, or the defining moment where Holocaust testimony entered the realm of global public acceptance. The survivor voice was finally granted a media centrality lacking some 20 years ago at Nuremberg, as over 100 witnesses were summoned to the stand in the Eichmann trial. And again, as you probably know, the Nuremberg trial, people say that's kind of the trial of documents. Of all of the witnesses summoned to the stand, only 3 actually were Jewish survivors. There was no Yiddish translator for the Nuremberg trial. And in the Eichmann trial, the global media coverage really helped create the conditions in which, as Pinchevsky, Liebes, and Herman note, where these broadcasts of, quote, severed voices redefined the conditions by which trauma could find public articulation. So radio played a central role in the dissemination of these voices, radio and also television. We might also think of survivors like Alexander Kulishevitz, formerly a Polish political prisoner at Sachsenhausen, performing in places like Berg Waldeck, West German protest festivals in camp uniform, or Esther Bejarano, who began to document her experiences in the Auschwitz Women's Orchestra in this period. And I should say I'm really excited this summer. I'm going to go to Hamburg and look at Esther Bejarano's papers at the Institute for Zeitgeschichte. So I'm very looking forward to that and very grateful for that opportunity, because they've been in preparation for the past 2 years. As anybody who's loves working in archives knows, sometimes you have to be a little bit patient. And of course, someone like Inge Lamel, who prepared the transcription, as you saw earlier in this talk, of the Buchenwald song. Inge Lamel was herself a child survivor who dedicated a large part of her life to preserving and collecting these concentration camp and ghetto melodies under the purview of her workers' song archive in the East German Academy of Arts. Song was also a rare musical realm where women's voices could be heard as frequently as men, as these singers used their voices to advocate for the victims of fascism, using song as a medium of social awareness and change decades before the legitimacy of the survivor's voice was a foregone conclusion. As historian Anna Hajakova notes, gender is a pervasive basic social category, and I would have sought to keep this at the forefront of my discussion of these testimonies. Lower rates of female Holocaust survival meant that these testimonies are statistically more likely to be male, resulting in fewer accounts of childbearing, mothering, sexual violence, and also descriptions of familial relationships that might be absent from men's testimonies. Despite these inherent challenges, feminist Holocaust scholars like Joan Ringelblum and Zoe Waxman have provided helpful models for how to work with women's testimonies, which often feature uniquely gender-based experiences. By listening in, what media scholar studies, Carolyn Birdsall and Eleanor Carmi, have identified as the invisible and often gendered labor of the creative process, we can also locate many women's musical testimonies in their work not only as performers, but as activists, pedagogues, and archivists. I'd like to focus a little bit on one particular singing survivor who lived in East Berlin. David Schneer has done a lot of fabulous work on Linyal Dati, and as he noted, she kind of became the Yiddish diva of the communist world and a central figure in East German Holocaust memory. So Yaldati was actually born in the Netherlands in 1912, and ended up surviving Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen. When she moved to the East German state in the 1950s, she ended up performing under the auspices of the East German state for over 35 years until her death in 1988. And she typically appeared with pianist Eberhard Raibling, a musicologist and rector of the Hochschule für Musik, Hans Eisler, who also happened to be her husband. Among the key pieces of her performance career was her friendship with Anne Frank, her experiences as a wife and mother, and thinking about this in relation to the double marginalization of her experience as a Dutch Jew living in East Germany, and how she navigated these multiple identities and represented these gendered experiences on stage. Among her most frequently performed sets was her Anne Frank concert program. Yaldati had been friends with the teenage diarist and a witness to her final days in Bergen-Belsen. It was Yaldati and her sister who had actually told Otto Frank about his daughter's final days in the summer of 1945. And Yaldati continued to think and write about Anne, especially after the 1947 publication of the teenager's diary. Yaldati's Anne Frank concert program originated in 1959 as an accompaniment to the DEFA film, the East German film studio, A Diary for Anne Frank. DEFA was the state-owned film studio of East Germany. And Yaldati and Eberhard Raibling accompanied this film on a concert tour of England and France to perform before public screenings of this movie. The film, I should say, and here's a sort of a movie poster for it, which I hope you can see, was actually not really at all about Anne Frank, but about the formerly high-ranking Nazi officials who the film claimed were living careful and comfortable bourgeois lives in West Germany. And once many presenters of this film in England and France found this out, the film screenings were canceled. And so the film was canceled, but Yaldati and Eberhard Raibling were still allowed to give their performance set. And so here's a performance which happened in London in 1959, and you can see the way in which Anne's image is framed here and politicized. And it was really interesting actually looking at Yaldati's paper in the Academy of Arts in Berlin and finding some letter exchanges between Otto Frank and Lynn Yaldati, and they had a close friendship throughout the rest of Otto Frank's life, but he did express discomfort at the way in which Yaldati would sometimes politicize Anne's image, Anne's diary text in these settings, which were clearly reflective of the East German state. Other films that Lynn Yaldati made under the auspices of DEFA was another short documentary film called Lynn Yaldati Sings, which was, again, not really about Lynn Yaldati, and much more about sort of the East German state and its anti-fascist orientation. But the film does feature an extended clip of Yaldati in, as you can see here, presumably a recreated barracks in Auschwitz, where she bursts into a rendition of the partisan song. And I'm going to go ahead and play a little bit of this clip here so you can hear what it is I'm talking about.
Geschrieben ist das Lied mit Geschrieben ist das Lied mit Blut und nicht mit Blei. Es ist nicht kein Lied von a Vogel läuft er frei. Es hat a Volk zwischen Vollen die gewähnt. Das Lied gesungen mit na Gannes in die Hand. Es hat a Volk zwischen Vollen die gewähnt. Das Lied gesungen mit na Gannes in die Hand. Sage nimmer mehr, du gehst den letzten Gang, weil gewölbt wie Blei den blauen Tag verschlang. Die ersehnte Stunde kommt und sie ist nah. Unser Massenschritt wird dröhnen, wir sind da. Die ersehnte Stunde kommt und sie ist nah. Unser Massenschritt wird dröhnen, wir sind da.
Okay, so you can hear really clearly here. So this song, the partisan song, was really a staple of Yaldaty's repertoire, and she closed pretty much all of her performances with it. It's a pre-war Soviet march with lyrics written in the Vilna ghetto by poet Hirsch Glick. And supposedly he was responding to the news of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. And you can see what's interesting about this clip is that she starts it singing in Yiddish, right, while in the barracks, and then kind of transitions into German when she's standing on this prominent stage in East Germany, singing before sort of a uniform of a audience of uniformed comrades. And we might also notice the way in which Yaldaty herself is staged here. She's not wearing the Star of David, but presumably sort of a light-colored triangle. And so her Jewishness as such is revealed really by her choice of Yiddish and not necessarily by the kind of signifiers of the concentration camp. So the film carefully treads this line between Jewish suffering and anti-fascist resistance, in line with commemorations and depictions of the Holocaust in the East, which focused on anti-fascism rather than Jewish suffering. Although Cold War politics certainly shaped Yaldaty's Holocaust-themed performances, it was ultimately the patronage of the East German state that made them possible in the first place. By performing the songs of the camps and ghettos, Yaldaty encouraged participatory singing to mold engaged citizens, or comrades, depending. As her performances made clear, survivor singers were living, breathing, sounded beings, rather than merely the silent figures captured in early Allied photographs. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Abby, for this really wonderful paper and kind of the presentation of important testimonies. Let me look into the chat what questions we have. The first question actually that we have is in regard to the various sources that you have shared with us and the response to anti-Semitism, which I think is so important to consider. How would you classify the responses if you have to propose a classification of them?
Yes, thank you for that question. Well, I would say it's interesting to look at how the survivor singers themselves thought about their Jewish identity and their relationship to Judaism. So, you know, I know Tina's done a lot of great work on Lynn Yaldaty, and I think Yaldaty was really interested in sort of showing herself as an anti-fascist, that was a key component of her identity, and maybe at times focusing less heavily on anti-Semitism in her work. If you look at someone like Esther Bejarano, the accordion in the Auschwitz Women's Orchestra that I mentioned briefly, she really built a career in activism in Hamburg, lived the last 60 years of her life there, was part of the Grandmas Against the Right movement, and really spoke very openly and publicly about Germany's embrace of people fleeing Syria. And so sort of framed, I guess, her fight against the rise in right politics as one against anti-Semitism, but also against all forms of right-leaning thinking. Kuliszewicz, the Polish political prisoner, is also a really interesting case because many people assume that he was Jewish. He was actually not Jewish, but he collected over 500 songs of the camps and ghettos and made those testimonies audible in various ways. And the other person I briefly mentioned, Inge Lamel, was an archivist and musicologist who lived and worked in East Germany and founded the Workers' Archive at the East German Academy of the Arts. And what's fascinating about her is that she kind of made a key cornerstone of the mission of the ALA to collect these songs already beginning in the 1950s of the concentration camps in the ghetto. And when I met her daughter for coffee last year, she told me that as a child, she had these memories of her mother hauling all of this recording equipment on the back of her bicycle in sort of rubbled Berlin to record various survivor singers so she could transcribe those melodies, because it's also interesting to think about people who maybe recalled these melodies who were Jewish survivors who did not perhaps have the training to notate the melodies themselves. And so oftentimes people would send Inge Lamel the texts of the songs, but they didn't know how to notate the melodies themselves or needed someone to transcribe that for them. It is interesting when I sort of read newspaper accounts too of these survivor singers. And sometimes people talk about the sort of lived raspy quality of their voices. When I'm looking sort of at newspaper reviews of the Aldate's performances in the late 40s, I also wonder too if censorship plays a role here, because the Allies still controlled a lot of the public media in Germany. And so what gets printed or what was censored is also an interesting question in relation to anti-Semitism.
Thank you. Another question, I'm reading it out. I was struck by the contrast between the emotion in the music and the banality of evil of the Nuremberg testimony. Do you have comments on that?
Oh, wow. That's a huge question. Yeah, oh, I think I'm gonna have to think about that a little bit more. But I do think there's an interesting way in which when we look sort of at these court testimonies and this idea that testimonies have to be juridical and completely objective, and then when we're looking at, say, a musical testimony, which arguably one could say tends to lean to the more subjective side, the way in which people used perhaps a singing voice in a way that could not appear in, say, a courtroom or juridical setting. I'm thinking of the really interesting work that actually Dylan Robinson is doing in Indigenous sound studies. And at the opening of his book, Hungry Listening, he actually talks about a court case about Indigenous land rights where this individual wanted to sing her testimony and the judge would not allow it. Because the judge felt that this would be distracting from the facts in the case. But I think that we're missing a whole kind of affective, emotional layer if we just discount something because it is sung versus when it is spoken.
Yeah, we have a lot of questions. Because our last speaker for today canceled, we can go a little bit over and address a few more, but maybe not all of them because they are really coming in. So I think the next question just warrants perhaps a shorter answer. So I'm asking on behalf of Joshua Jacobson, colleague from Boston. What about Shmerke Kaschaginski, who also collected songs after the war? Was he less reliable?
That's a great question. No, I wouldn't. Well, I wouldn't call any of these individuals less reliable or more reliable. I think what's so beautiful and rich about these sonic accounts are actually when there are differences in terms of text or adjustments people made in terms of lyrics. I mean, the Buchenwald song, for example, people changed it, from when we will be free to when we are free in the post-war period. Or people might have had different melodic variations that they learned in their particular regional settings. Or if you even think of the relationship of these singers to these songs decades in the aftermath. One of the testimonies I'm looking at was by a Czech political prisoner. She wrote these melodies in the Ravensbrück concentration camp, but revisited them 20 years later and added new harmonies, added new verses. What does that mean? Why was she, and what do we do with these two testimonial objects? They're testifying really to different experiences. On the one hand, we have this crumpled, nearly ruined handwritten score, and on the other hand, 20 years later, this really beautiful kind of clean copy of the quote unquote same piece. So yeah, I think Brett Verve has done a lot of really great work on this kind of early Yiddish song collecting too.
Yeah, so we have questions from our participants in the in-person part of the conference and their colleagues. So I'd like them to encourage just reaching out to you directly, and I'd like to address just one more question and bring it up from Yuval Bar-On, and that is a question that pertains specifically how survivor singing is related to anti-Semitism in particular, in line with the conversation that we have had so far in the conference. So she asks, of course, it is a response to Nazism and fascism, but is it a means coping with anti-Semitism in a particular way?
Yeah, thanks for that, Yuval. Yuval and I have been in conversation all semester. Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think that music kind of provided this space for people whose voices were otherwise silenced or marginalized. And that is something that really fascinates me because, you know, if you look at, say, a printed memoir or a printed text, there was a certain amount of censorship that would go into the production of those objects versus if you have a performance happening in real time that may or may not have been recorded, that provides kind of a fleeting, ephemeral space for someone to speak about recent traumatic experience. I'm thinking of Simone Laux, who conducted the Auschwitz Men's Orchestra and wrote Melodies of Auschwitz, his memoir, in France and in the French language. And then when it was translated into Polish in the early 1950s, they made him change a lot of the passages because they felt he was too positive towards the Nazis and the German soldiers and German guards. Now, when he was composing music about his experience of internment, those were allowed to be performed in post-war Poland. He wrote pieces, I think, in 1947 and in 1960. Those were performed without any kind of censorship or commentary about depictions which were too positive one way or the other. But I do think, yes, that these performances, recordings, and especially songs gave people this rare public platform, despite the fact that they really may have lost everything.
Thank you so much, Abby. I'm sure some colleagues will reach out to you by email. We all have your email. It's in the program book. If other colleagues who are in our session here want to reach out, feel free. We have posted a link to the program book in the main chat. And again, thank you very much, Abby. I'd like to now transition to our next speaker. Our second and last speaker for today, Roxanne Lindlacher from the Paris Lodron University Salzburg. Her full bio will be in the main chat, and her presentation is on Schlager in German language sheet music editions from 1945 to 1950. Roxanne, welcome to our session. And if you have a PowerPoint presentation that you want to share, now is the moment. We are looking forward to hearing your presentation.
Yes, thank you for the introduction. I try to share my screen. There's a lot of stuff showing. Is it showing already?
Not quite yet.
Okay.
There we go. So if you
Okay.
want to click on presenter mode, you could do that.
Yes.
Or navigate the slides in another way.
All right. I think it's working now. Okay. Yeah, thank you so much for the introduction. I will start right away with some music.
Bei Capri die rote Sonne im Meer versieht und vom Himmel die bleiche Sichel des Mondes fliegt.
The Schlager Capri-Fischer from 1941 is one of the most popular hits of the post-war period in Germany and Austria. In the German-speaking world, the term Schlager can be understood as the dominant form of the popular song that emerged around the turn of the century in connection with the increasing commercialization of the music business. In 1946, Rudi Schurike's recording from 1943 became a big hit at a time characterized by a lost war, a failed ideology, and the mass murder of millions of people. We hear longing for Italy and exoticism, gentle tango sounds, and a generally idyllic atmosphere. As cynical as it may sound, a song like Capri Fischer can be seen as a representative of the post-war German popular music landscape. Jewish people who were an integral part of the German entertainment industry before 1933 were marginalized, humiliated, forced to flee or deported and murdered in the 12 years before the end of the war. So how does the entertainment industry deal with this social rift? In my presentation, I aim to examine how German language popular music developed between 1945 and 1950. What role do Jewish people play after the end of the war? How are they integrated into the world of popular music? How does anti-Semitism manifest itself, or how are the atrocities of the Nazis dealt with? Where can continuities or breaks between the time before and after 1945 be recognized? I want to answer these questions using the medium of sheet music as production processes, the involvement of various people with different functions, and certain aesthetic aspects can be traced here. Sheet music describes a folded sheet with an often illustrated title page, 2 pages of music for voice and piano, and a reverse page with advertising. It is important to emphasize that in the 30s and 40s, it was a standardized mass product that was created through a division of labor and was developed primarily for private music making at home. The medium is at the center of my dissertation, in which I deal with the staging of human bodies in German language single-song editions between 1930 and 50. For this purpose, I have already collected and analyzed around 800 sheet music copies from various archives, such as the AKM archive in Linz, Austria, or the ZPKM archive in Freiburg, Germany. The dissertation project is part of the German-Austrian collaborative research project PopPrints, the production of popular music in Austria and Germany, 1930 to 50, of the universities of Augsburg, Salzburg, and the Bruckner University Linz. As part of the project, a handbook is currently in the process of publication by Bloomsbury, which re-evaluates the production conditions of popular music during this period. Further information on the project can be found on our homepage or on our Instagram channel. The post-war period is also central to my dissertation, and today I will concentrate primarily on the role of coming to terms with the past, anti-Semitism, and the integration of Jewish people. Before I go into more detail about the period from 1945 to 1950, it is necessary to look at the years before that in order to understand the extent and form of anti-Semitism in sheet music production and to recognize continuities and breaks after 1945. Let's start with a few figures. In the 192 hits from the year 1930 that I examined, Jewish people were involved as authors or lyricists a total of 189 times, including multiple entries. As there are between 2 to 3 people involved for one song, this shows that Jewish composers and lyricists make out between 32 and 49% of the personnel involved. Jewish people were therefore central to popular music production. When the Nazis came to power in 1933, Jewish people were systematically excluded. On November 1st, 1933, the newly established Reichskulturkammer, Reich Chamber of Culture, enacted its first law forcing anyone who was involved to, in the production, reproduction, preservation, sale, or mediation of the sale of cultural property to become a member of one of the 7 professional chambers. So only through membership in the Reich Chamber of Music, or short RMK, is the practice of the profession still permitted. Thus, the Reich Chamber of Culture, headed by Goebbels, strived to control all music makers by registering and checking all persons and, if necessary, imposing bans on them. From 1934, the Reich Chamber of Music excluded Jewish people, and proof of descent must be presented. In Austria, Jewish people were able to continue working as artists, however, with censorship by the Austro-fascist state, until they were abruptly affected by reprisals after the Anschluss in 1938. On a side note, in 1940, an encyclopedia of Jews in music was published, collecting Jewish works of arts and artists. In his dissertation on popular music and Nazi persecution, Christoph Domke states, "The reason for the expulsion of musicians from the entertainment industry lay almost exclusively in their Jewish origins." This is also reflected in my observations. In 1935, I was only able to identify the participation of Jewish artists 52 times in a total of 125 scores, all but 2 of which were published in Austria. So the percentage of Jews involved drops rapidly. And in 1940, I did not find a single Jewish person involved in 27 sheet music editions. So the persecution of Jewish people can be shown by these figures, but also by the various personal fates that appear in the medium of sheet music. One example is the author Fritz Löhner-Beda, often referred to simply as Beda. Born in Bohemia in 1883, he was one of Austria's most popular Schlager and operetta lyricists in the 20s and 30s. The reverse page of a song from 1923 shows a dedication to him on the occasion of the publication of his 50th song by the publication house Wiener Bohem. In 1938, after the Anschluss of Austria, he was arrested and sent to various concentration camps. He was beaten to death in a forced labor factory near Auschwitz in 1942. Sheet music shows how rapidly individual people who had been celebrated were persecuted and murdered by the regime. Sheet music can also point to anti-Semitism in music production in other ways. The 1930 edition of the song Spiel mir das Lied noch einmal names Heinrich Strecker as the composer and Max Leo Deutsch and Steff Kurzer as the lyricists. In a new edition from 1937, only the word Spiel was replaced by sing in the text, while the music was printed unchanged. Hans Robinger is now named as co-author alongside Steff Kurzer. The Jewish lyricist Max Leo Deutsch was stripped of his copyrights here in order to help the popular, now Aryanized hit song achieve renewed success. He was murdered in Poland during the Shoah. This shows the appalling situation in which Jewish and other persecuted artists in Germany and Austria were deprived of their rights, royalties, and participation in cultural life during the 1930s. Antisemitism thus manifests itself in the persecution, exclusion, and murder of Jewish people. Another aspect of antisemitism is the rejection of so-called Jewish elements in music. The Nazis did not always agree on this. The terms Kulturbolschewismus, modernism, and jazz were often used. The lack of clarity caused 2 problems for the Nazis. Firstly, that they themselves did not know what was to be understood as Jewish music, and their argumentation as to why, for example, jazz should be equated with Jewish is confusing and contradictory. And secondly, that the musicians who were allowed to practice were largely indifferent to this and continued to orient themselves towards the popular style, for which they were only persecuted arbitrarily, if at all. As Niels Grosch observes, first and foremost, people were persecuted and not, or at best, subordinately works, styles, genres. However, what also became clear to me after sifting through over 800 pieces of sheet music is that anti-Semitic content hardly ever appears. I found only one example, and even that is dedicated to a Jewish friend, and therefore probably not anti-Semitic out of ideological conviction, but rather through the reproduction of cliches. Otherwise, there are no Jewish figures, cliches, or even musical references in my entire corpus of sources. However, the exclusion of other people, such as Black people and foreigners, does take place. Exoticizing lyrics, musical styles, and dances such as the tango offer a space for the Aryan ethnic community to set itself apart from the exotic other. At the same time, such forms also resonate with a longing for faraway places, the dream of the South, and thus a form of entertainment that gives people in Germany and Austria something new and interesting that they will probably never be able to experience. These forms of othering are therefore primarily based on the desire for entertainment rather than ideological slogans. The exclusion or exoticization of Jewish people, on the other hand, promises primarily negative feelings, which is not necessarily desirable in popular music. This leads to the conclusion that anti-Semitism played no role in the content of popular song from the Nazi era. So what was the situation after the fall of the Nazi regime and during the occupation by the Allies in Germany and Austria? What was the position of Jewish people, and how did anti-Semitism manifest itself? The legal exclusion of Jews from cultural life ended with the end of the Second World War. The Reich Chamber of Music was dissolved, ending the racist registration of musicians. As a result, it is once again possible for Jewish people to work as musicians, composers, lyricists, or publishers. I also did not find any form of censorship from the Allies. Yes, and some of the Jewish people decided to do so. Returnees such as Hermann Leopoldi, a Jewish composer from Vienna, or Robert Gilbert, a German Jewish lyricist, were able to build on the successes of the pre-war period or before 1933. Leopoldi, for example, became one of the most popular Schlager composers of the post-war period in Austria, and he is at the same time the composer of the Buchenwald-Lied, which was written in the concentration camp together with the murdered Fritz Löhner-Beder. At the request of Viennese politicians, he returned to Vienna in 1947. As Viktor Matejka, a Viennese city politician at the time, reports, Viennese politicians opposed the return of all Jewish artists. Only Leopoldi was to return as he created a, quote, good atmosphere and bombed out Vienna. Leopoldi is one of the more or less positive examples of the reintegration of Jewish people into German-speaking cultural life. For many other survivors or emigrants, the situation was difficult. Those who did decide to return had to reestablish themselves from scratch, often against the resistance of the population. Those music creators who were expelled from the AKM, the Austrian Collecting Society, in 1938, for example, had to submit a new application for membership after the end of the war, and it was only through their active application that the persecuted persons who had been deprived of their copyrights became members again. In his study on returnees from exile to West Germany, Matthias Pizzerni identifies 48 people in the field of popular music, 33 of whom remained permanently, however, without a fixed time frame. Compared to the number of returnees in the field of art music, this number is quite low. A return to the time before 1933, when Jews were an integral part of the entertainment industry, remains utopian. Many were murdered or emigrated and no longer wanted to return. The survivors and those who did return were definitely a minority. In sheet music of the time, a similar picture emerges. The composers and lyricists of the past years still form the majority and continue to shape German language musical life after flimsy denazification procedures. My figures show the following. In 37 sheet music editions from 1945, I found 4 people involved who were of Jewish descent, including 1 US Army soldier. 5 years later, Jewish people were involved a total of 13 times in 110 copies of sheet music, which means only a minimal percentage increase. So in 1950, there are statistically between 4 and 6% of Jewish involvements in sheet music production. In terms of content, there are more continuities than breaks with regard to anti-Semitic themes. Jewish people still did not feature in the content of popular songs. Neither positive nor negative feelings towards them, nor any acknowledgement of their existence. The Schlager remained a space in which anti-Semitism was not dealt with, nor were Jewish figures exoticized, such as Black people or people from foreign countries. While the occupying soldiers and the new reality of life in the post-war period, also with the destroyed cities and the lack of food, certainly received attention, though mostly in a humorous way, the horrors of war were not addressed. There was no reappraisal of anti-Semitism, nor is there any change in the portrayal of Jewish people, which is no portrayal at all. One trend that is particularly evident in the Wiener Lied, a genre of popular song that is closely linked to the city of Vienna and its culture, was nostalgia and the desire for things to return to the way they used to be. This was probably the most open form of self-reflection, the desire to leave the war period behind and return to the ideal of the pre-war era, be it the Habsburg Empire or Austrofascism, actually. The fact is that Jewish people were also part of those periods, which means that their participation in social life is not explicitly, but in a way implicitly idealized. The fact that coming to terms with the past and one's own role in the persecution of Jews was not a topic of popular music is possibly due to the function of popular music. Before, during, and after the war, it served primarily as entertainment. Unlike film and literature, popular music was not a means of implementing anti-Semitic propaganda. For the Nazis, popular music was above all one thing, entertainment, or, well, the stabilization of the system through entertainment. But it was not necessarily a tool for the visualization of so-called problems, such as Jewish people. For reasons of time, I will not read out the words of Joseph Goebbels. This view of the role of popular music is not limited to the Nazis. It is conditioned by the free market, which regulates itself through what people like to listen to and buy. The ideological, moral, and reflective grasp of sheet music is being surpassed by the paradigm of entertainment and capitalism. As I have been able to show, the study of sheet music reveals continuities in the absence of anti-Semitism in the content of popular songs from 1945 to 1950. Jewish people took part in popular music production only to a small extent, and in the 5 post-war years, there was almost no increase to be observed. Moreover, they often had to start from scratch and integrate themselves independently into structures that had excluded them until recently. Jewish agency was thus actively in demand and can be seen in the examples of individuals. But the dominant role that Jewish people played in the pre-war period remained utopian. Moreover, the medium of popular music was not used to reflect on the German people's own position during the Nazi regime or to comment on social restructuring. Such processes of coming to terms with the past do not take place here, as the medium is primarily market-oriented. However, I would also like to point out that in the immediate years after the war, the whole media landscape did not deal with the Nazi period. It was not until the 1960s to 80s that the first attempts were made to do so, and also to use music as such a medium. Looking at the popular music of the post-war period, we are left with an idealized world that makes the atrocities of the Nazis fade away, as the Capri-Fischer was supposed to show at the beginning. Sheet music thus provides a valuable insight into the processes of music production in the post-war period, which to a large extent was not all that different from the pre-war and war period, only as becomes clear with the serious decimation of Jewish agents. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Roxanne, for this very thoughtful study and the presentation of your subject, which I think is a really kind of important topic to broach, especially in the context of Schlager. We have a question from Nils Falch, who wants you to elaborate on the song Bei mir bist du schön. He gives some cues about how it was being used under the Nazis, and also reminds us that it was recorded by the Andrews sisters and perpetuated by the comedian harmonists. And he wonders whether you can elaborate on this particular song.
I'm really sorry, I can't. I know it, of course. Also sang it, but I have to say that this is a blind spot in my own studies. I have not really been studying it in that form. Sorry, my English always leaves me when I'm doing the questions. I'm sorry.
No, it's an honest answer, so don't worry about this at all. But that brings me to the next question. So you focus specifically on the period 1945 to 1950, but and editions of music. So I kind of wonder what this actually means in terms of your quantitative approach. So how do you mentioned some of the archives where you found the editions, but do you think at this point you have found actually all the editions, and in quantitative measures, what is the amount of sheet music that is relevant for your study?
Yes. Okay. So this could be a rather long answer, because I am struggling with my archival situation a little bit. The AKM archive is my main source in Linz, as it collected copies from every song that was published in Austria between, well, its foundation in 1898 and then until it was dissolved in 1938. And between 38 and 1945, I don't have any copies at all, because the AKM was integrated into the German Stagma, which was then bombed. So there is basically nothing there. And then, of course, from 45 to 50, everything was just starting again. The whole machinery was just starting again. So there's a lot less to find there. Also, as you might have noticed in my figures, in 1930, I was able to acquire 192 copies. And from, well, 1940, it's really low. And then it goes up to 110 in 1950 again. So yeah, I'm also struggling with this a little bit, because it is not possible for me, also not with other archives in the German-speaking world, to really, well, represent it in an adequate way, just by using the numbers, because it is really hard for me to acquire enough sheet music. And also, what is enough? Yeah, that is a question I was also asking myself, and in my dissertation, therefore, I am not really relying on this quantitative aspect so much. I'm actually, well, analyzing human bodies, and I am, of course, collecting a, quite large corpus of sources, and then I will select single editions and analyze them. However, I thought it would be helpful for this talk today to actually work with what I have and take these figures. And yes, they are not really representative. If I'm looking at 1945 and I only find 30 copies, that's not quite enough to say that it's like the absolute number. But I think it's I try my best with everything I've got, and yeah, I'm also at the beginning still. I'm in my at the beginning of my second year of my dissertation, so I'm hoping to find more, and especially on the years between 38 and 1950, so that it can all maybe also be expanded on the quantitative aspects, which is really interesting, of course.
Great, yeah. Given that you are still in kind of the initial phase of your research, I wonder how you will tackle the kind of distinction between German and Austrian, and whether you also think of including German-speaking Switzerland.
Yes. So I've decided not to include Switzerland. However, there is, of course, a huge difference between Germany and Austria between 1933 and 38. And actually, I also work with quite a lot of Austrian sheet music, as the AKM archive is currently my main archive. So Austrofascism is a whole new world, as the whole production structures and ideological influences are quite different from Nazi Germany. So comparing these two, Germany and Austria, before the Anschluss, is quite central in my dissertation. Yeah. And also, of course, after 1945, the situation is different. Yeah. I'm sorry, I cannot.
Sorry, I was muted. Rachel Teplow is following up and is asking if it is too early, if you have a hypothesis for why there are so few Jews in the post-war sheet music world, and she also inquires whether you want to distinguish between West and East Germany, which only really affects 1 year, given the foundation of the states in 1949. But it's
Yes.
maybe something interesting to kind of address and think about. See how you want to respond.
Yes, thank you for the question. Yes, it is 1 year. I haven't decided yet as to how deep I'm going into East and West Germany, because it also opens up quite a lot and I have to finish sometime. But it's interesting, of course. And also, what was the other part of the question? I'm sorry.
It was, let me just go back. It was about whether you have an argument or a hypothesis for why
Yes.
there are so few Jews in the post-war sheet music world.
Well, quite a few were murdered. That is actually when I'm looking at the names from my list from 1930, and I researched every one of them. I would say that from maybe 50 who appear, 15 to 20 did not survive, and the rest emigrated. And I think that for, well, some of them returning back to Germany was what they really wanted to do. Also, maybe because it was hard for them in exile to really find their community and find work. And but I think most of them, yeah, really just didn't want to come back out of many reasons. And it really was a huge loss for German Schlager industry that the whole society after 1945 made it so hard for the Jewish authors, not just through anti-Semitism in the society, but also because the structures were not there. So yeah, returning, or well, some did return but decided not to stay. I also showed the figures from Matthias Pacciani, who said 48 returned, but only 33 stayed. So what does that number tell us? Quite a lot, probably. Yeah.
Well, also you need to consider really the foundation of the State of Israel in 1948 and what it did to the numbers. I think that's important in thinking about how this Periclean period is slowly fading out after 1948.
Yes.
Our colleague Abby Anderton has a question. She'd like to ask you if there are any forms of Jewish resistance to the Nazis in these Schlager, and whether you know of any satirical songs that have survived.
Are you thinking about the period from 45 to 50 or
She
before?
doesn't specify this, but this is 1945 to 1950 is the core period of your research. So let's start from there and see
Yes.
if Abby follows up.
Well, I know about one from Hans Eisler, who in 45 already published in Austria one song. But other than that, in popular music, I'm not really seeing anything like that. In art music, of course, it's a little different. I'm thinking of Schönberg here. But no, satirical songs, sadly not. And my thesis for that may be that also for the Jewish artists who were returning and who wanted to start fresh in Germany, they also had to sell their music. And this is really like the core argument of my whole dissertation already. It crystallized that so much is about capitalism, really, and about entertainment and about selling stuff. And the whole ideological aspect is quite important, and also the aspect of, well, one's own agency, one's own messages that one wants to transport. But it all like takes a step back behind the just wish to be popular and to well sell their sheet music.
Yeah. We have we have many questions. So let me just see how we deal with this. A question from our colleague David Buch, who I pronounce in the German way because it's another book that I feel very close to. So he actually wonder whether you have considered the various ways that the Nazis dealt with the so-called mixed race folks that have been involved in the popular music. How dealt the Nazis with the music and the texts that were collaborations also between Jews and non-Jews. He gives some examples from opera where those collaborations actually existed. So this is a question pertaining to the period that is outside your research focus, but maybe you want to still address this.
Yes, so it is inside my dissertation, so I do actually feel able to answer it. And well, the whole Schlager industry is something that moves very quickly. So a hit from 1930 is not really that important in 1935. So hits that were, for example, published in the 20s or beginning 30s are not really en vogue in the later years. So that is one aspect. And then, well, from 1934 on, Jewish people were just not allowed to publish music, to play music. So there were no collaborations really. So yeah, this is something that I actually haven't really found in my whole sources, that from 1933 we have any sort of collaborations between Jewish people and not Jewish people in Germany. In Austria, they still happened and they were popular and they were, yeah, they were there.
Good. Well, thank you. We are almost out of time. Our session officially ends at 11:45 with the cancelled paper. So I think there are, again, many more questions coming in. So let me just, because we have several questions from one participant, just capture one. This is about the fact that many Jewish participants in the music world were labeled bureaucratically or socially as Jewish, if there's anything distinctive Jewish in their work. In other words, were they anonymous? Could one identify them as Jews based on features, nuances, elements of their craft? I think you have addressed this actually already in your presentation, but I think that given that this came in, it might be a moment to elaborate on this.
Yes, so I'm not the expert on musical style. Actually, Niels Grosch, who is also my counselor for my dissertation, can talk about it quite a lot, and also I think Pamela Potter. But as far as we in the Pop Prince team have found, there is actually no such elements that you can distinguish the song from a Jewish person and a not Jewish person, or just, of course, personal style is something that we can see all the time, but and this is also what our research project wants to highlight, that musical style is actually just not really able to be grasped. I don't know if you say it like that, because the whole industry didn't really stylistically change through the exclusion of Jewish people. Quite a lot of creative input was lost, of course. I'm really thinking about Fritz Löhner-Beder, whose lyrics were just very satirical at times, and they were missing from 1938 on, but in a musical sense, there is no really style change that we can see. And that is maybe also a myth that has been established in the whole process of coming to terms with the past, that so much musically was lost, and that in the Nazi period the musical style declined and everything got really, really low because it was just all ideologically and from the state regulated. But we do think that that is actually not true, but that is just one thought, and it needs to be proven. So yeah, I refer to Niels Grosch on that.
Thank you so much. This is really fantastic research that you are doing, and it will be very interesting how it evolves throughout. So thank you for also having an extended discussion period in English, and we really appreciate that we could address so many questions. There are actually many more questions that came in. Not all of them can be addressed because we are literally out of time. But the presenters' emails are in the program. There is the possibility of follow-up, and I encourage anybody who's interested in follow-up to resume the discussions outside the Zoom venue. It's now my distinct pleasure to give some closing remarks to you, colleagues, presenters, guests, and friends. We really appreciate everybody who has participated in any way in the in-person part of the conference and in the Zoom part of the conference. After we draw to a close, after these thought-provoking days together, I'd like to take a moment now to reflect on the journey we have shared and the significance of our collective work. Over the past sessions, we have delved deeply into the intricate and often fraught intersection of music, sound, and anti-Semitism, which has been defined in various ways by different presenters in their papers. Our program has taken us through the chilling soundscapes of music under Nazism to the contemporary challenges posed by anti-Semitic expressions in white power music. We have heard how music is both an art and a social practice, can be a vessel for both resilience and harm. Presenters have illuminated how across history and geography, music has been used to marginalize, stereotype, and persecute. We've also seen how music can become a space of survival, resistance, and repair. This conference has not shied away from complexity. We have engaged with difficult legacies, composers beloved for their music, yet compromised by their views, scholarly traditions, and expressions that carry bias and perpetuate stereotypes and cultural narratives that continue to marginalize or distort Jewish voices. These discussions are not easy, but they are necessary. And you have all demonstrated the intellectual integrity and human empathy that such work requires. The diversity of perspectives presented here has enriched our understanding of the complex ways in which anti-Semitism is encoded, transmitted, and sometimes challenged through music. The interdisciplinary dialogue fostered here is itself a form of resistance, of refusal to let anti-Semitism go unexamined or unchallenged in any sphere, least of all in the cultural and artistic domain that shape our societies so profoundly. I want to express heartfelt gratitude to all of our presenters for their rigorous scholarship and to our chairs for guiding the conversations with insight and care. Special thanks are due to my co-organizers, Samantha Cooper, Gordon Dale, and Michael Levitt, for their dedication, as well as to Julia Viegas for seamless administration, and to our partners, the American Society for Jewish Music, the Jewish Music Forum, and the YIVO Institute. As we move forward, let us carry with us the urgency of the questions raised here. How can we, as scholars, artists, educators, and community members, continue to document, analyze, and counteract the ways in which anti-Semitism persists and evolves in musical and sonic cultures? How can we ensure that the stories of resilience, creativity, and resistance are not lost, but amplified? As we move beyond these sessions, let us not leave these conversations behind. Let us take them with us in our classrooms, our writing, our archives, our activism. Let us continue to interrogate the structures that shape our disciplines, our repertoires, and our listening habits. And let us ensure that Jewish voices, past, present, and future, are not only preserved, but heard, respected, and celebrated. Our work does not end with the closing of this conference. The conversations we've begun here about the power of music to both harm and heal, about the responsibilities of scholarship, and about the preservation of intangible cultural heritage must continue. Thank you for your engagement, your questions, and your commitment and civility. In closing, I'd like to lean on a line from the lullaby we heard during the in-person portion of the conference. Fear not, little one, do not forget who you are. Thank you all, and until we meet again. With these lines, I'd like to close the Zoom part of the conference, and I wish you all a good day, and I hope that we'll be in touch with some recorded portions and continue our dialogue as we meet again. Thank you.